I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Windmueller, Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Service, Jack H. Skirball Campus of Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. You can't hear me? Oh. Oh, okay. Okay. Is that? No. Okay. So he was trained as a political scientist, has studied Jewish political behavior over a 40-year career as an academic and communal professional. His presentation will focus on the history of the Jewish vote, specific indicators likely to impact the Jewish vote, connection with this election, and some national trends regarding ethnic and religious voting patterns. He will examine some of the key political ideologies critical to the 2024 campaign. Okay, well, without further ado,
good morning, and thank you for the invitation to join you. This is the 15th of 25 presentations I'm making on the election, so you'll bear with me if some of this, for me, sounds mundane, but for you, sounds rather extraordinary or depressing. So let us begin our journey in one of the most extraordinary elections in American history. It is the 60th election of a United States president, the last 10 of which have been decided by less than 5 points. The previous 10, since the end of the Second World War, were decided by 10 or more points, simply showing the extraordinary shifts in American politics over the past 20 years. In this year alone, literally 2 billion people in the world will be electing or have elected officials to their government, as 8 of the 10 largest democracies in the world are holding elections in this year. The American Jewish experience suggests that Jews have been passionate about their politics, and yet we only account for roughly 2% of the American population. But we are deeply committed and engaged with American political behavior and practice, as reflected by the fact of the number of folks who run for public office, who commentate and reflect on politics, and on the fact that Jews vote. We vote in higher numbers than any other ethnic, racial, or religious group in the United States. 85% of us, on average, tend to vote. Yet, the Jewish community is concentrated in basically 8 states. 75% of us live in those particular states, of which only one of those states is in play in this election, that's Pennsylvania. The reality is that in this context, those 75% or those 8 states account for 188 electoral votes. You need 270, as you recall, to be elected to the presidency of the United States. Indeed, this is an election that we will note as we move forward that's bound by and tied to some very specific issues that have defined the Jewish vote in this election or will define it. I mean, Jews have been here since the beginning of this society, as you know, and as a result, we almost have a contract with America. The First Amendment to the Constitution ensures the separation of church and state. It speaks to the freedoms of assembly and speech. The 6th article of the Constitution references that there shall be no religious test. This is one of those few places in the world where religion and state do not define or do not shape the political framework. It is also a society in which the very first president of the United States, George Washington, in his letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island in 1789, frames this contract by assuring what he calls the stock of Abraham will live safely and securely in these borders. But it was Lincoln who would pursue this contract in an extraordinary way. Ulysses S. Grant issued Order Number 11 in the fall of 1862, which would remove all Jews living in the Tennessee River Valley from that area. It was the only time in American history where Jews were singled out for a particular action, a negative action, which was designed to remove them from their homes. And the Jewish community responds, and in February of 1863, Lincoln orders Grant to rescind this particular military order. The importance of that is not so much that the Jewish community acted and that Lincoln responded, but that Lincoln would become a symbol for the Jewish community that had profound importance to their political character and investment. As an example, from the election of 1864 till 1900, the Jewish vote in the United States was totally Republican. And it was tied to Lincoln. He dies on Passover. And the extraordinary stories, sermons, and messages delivered by leaders of the Jewish community about Lincoln, in a sense, confirms that special relationship that he had with the 19th century's Jewish community. But Jews have been part of the political process certainly well into the 19th century. And referenced here are the congressional and senatorial candidates that have run and served. And as you will note, there were actually, over the course of these decades and this history, 9 United States Supreme Court justices who were also Jewish. 8. Some commentators have suggested over the years that politics is the American Jewish religious experience. And others have suggested that abortion is more significant to Jewish voters than Israel. We'll look at that one more carefully later. A third commentator, Milton Himmelfarb, in 1968 suggested that Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans, which was his struggle to figure out why the Jewish community was so much part of the liberal and democratic tradition that was the 20th century's contribution to how and where the Jewish community found itself. But in reality, the Jewish vote has and is continuing to change. It never has totally remained static. And what we need to understand is that the shifts take place because liberalism itself is a moving target. It's the ability of a community to find ideas or causes within liberalism that they identify with and other causes which they may reject. But what is particularly significant about the Jewish community is that it's also been a community that has seen third political parties as very important. For example, in the 1920 election, the Jewish community votes in extraordinarily high numbers for the socialist candidate, Eugene V. Debs, and Senator La Follette of Wisconsin were two such candidates that ran in various campaigns in the early part of the 20th century. And both did extraordinarily well because Jews coming from Eastern Europe brought with them the ideas of socialism and communism, and they were applied and adopted as part of their political discourse in the early part of the 20th century. So we're going to take a look at a few past elections to sort of see the trend lines of Jewish voting. Henry Wallace, who runs in the 1948 campaign, is a progressive. And American Jews, 15% of us voted for him in that election. The 1980 election is probably the most interesting for political scientists in terms of the Jewish vote, because Ronald Reagan is contesting the presidency with the incumbent Jimmy Carter. And there is a third candidate, John Anderson, who runs, as you may remember, from Illinois, who runs separate campaign and does extremely well again with Jewish voters. Carter's campaign is the one occasion we see in the 20th century where the Jewish community flees the Democratic Party in terms of the size or numbers that we had historically identified with Jews as voting democratically. But the construct here is what happens in 1984 when Reagan runs again and does less well. He drops 8-9 points from where he was with the Jewish community. And political scientists suggest to us that the moral majority, which arrives on the scene as a major political force in the 1980s, and more directly in the impact of the 1984 election, actually scares a number of Jewish voters who are concerned that this was a kind of effort to create and break down the wall of separation between church and state. The 2008 campaign involving Barack Obama and his second campaign, 2012, again we note the decline in support for President Obama in the second campaign. But it turns out that he would lose support from women, from Hispanics, from Asians, and even from African Americans in 2012. So that the pattern of the losses here that we see with the Jewish vote is paralleled with what we've seen elsewhere with the second Obama campaign. So these were the outcomes we would see in the last two elections. 2016, Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, and Joe Biden's campaign in 2020 against the former president, Donald Trump. It is important to note that third-party candidates were far more significant in 2016, and we see a significantly larger number of Jewish voters going third-party in 2016 than we did in 2020, which results in some of the interesting outcomes that we will note about these elections. We have outtake polls of Jewish voters specifically in Pennsylvania and Florida from 2020, and they differ radically, which is telling us that there may be geographical differences amongst Jewish voters around the country. We now have polls for 2024 of Jewish voters that confirms that, which means, for example, that Florida Jews are more conservative, tend to vote more Republican than Pennsylvania Jews, and that the 300,000 Jewish voters in Pennsylvania who will be critical in 2 weeks from now will be very much watched in terms of whether there are changes from their behaviors in 2020 to this coming election. We also note that some of the polls are conducted by the parties themselves, by Jewish groups that represent particular interests, so we try to discount those particular polls to try to get a more balanced and sort of nonpartisan perspective about polling. So we do have a Pew study. It is out about 6 weeks, and it suggests that Donald Trump is doing better with Jewish voters this go around than previously, and we can certainly document why that might be the case. But this particular poll suggests that President Trump will basically jump almost 7 to 10 points over his previous connections with the Jewish community. We have a second poll produced by The Economist, the magazine, which suggests an even larger Trump vote inside the Jewish community that will go to 37%. And we have several other polls, but those polls, as I suggest, come to us from various partisan places, and therefore we tend to discount them. But what we need to understand is that all of them are confirming a more significant position within the Jewish community that Donald Trump will most likely achieve. We are watching Generation Z voters. These are 18-year-olds to 35-year-olds because they are going to be really telling us a lot about future voting patterns. And we will see a lot of new voters this go around because there is the largest generation of young people that we've seen in this country, and they will begin to show their political clout. The second group we're watching are American Orthodox Jewish voters because they are the fastest growing part of the American Jewish communal process, and their numbers will increase and their role politically will be increasing. And we know from all of the studies we have from 2020, and in my book on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, we looked specifically at the Orthodox community as an important voice to see that certainly 70% or more of Orthodox voters were supporting the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. And we see that pattern continuing, and that the more traditional, that is Haredi Orthodox, are far more likely to support Republican candidates than modern Orthodox voters. So we see a pattern of different trends within the American Orthodox community. We think there are 7 states, as you know, you've been following all the news. I call them the Bagel Belt, but they are certainly the key states for this election. What the numbers next to the state's name represent is the percentage of Jewish voters in that state. So Michigan is 1.7%, whereas Pennsylvania, as I pointed out, is 2.7%. But in a close election, in these 7 states, Jewish voters are in play, and especially for sure in Pennsylvania, where the numbers can make a significant difference in the outcome. I think we need to step back and look at both conservative and liberal political perspectives in this country, because we don't have a kind of unanimity of how and what a Republican Jewish voter looks like. We actually have a variety of different behaviors or positions, if you wish. And the most significant piece of this are identity politics voters, the first group. And these are voters who say, is it good for the Jews kind of question. And they look at issues such as Israel and anti-Semitism and foreign policy and national security as very critical voting considerations as Jewish political activists. And they represent the single largest piece of the Republican Jewish cohort. The second grouping are neoconservatives, but they have been around since the 1970s. These were former Democrats who broke with the Democratic Party in the period of the late 1960s, and they come out of Commentary, the magazine that had been established by the American Jewish Committee, to create a whole ideology about an alternative conservatism, because they were not really being welcomed by William Buckley's conservatives, although Buckley personally did. But the neoconservative construct is to suggest that Israel is a kind of prototype of the kind of democracies we should be promoting across the globe. So Madeleine Albright, as an example, who was a former Secretary of State, reflected her politics through this neoconservative lens, even though she herself was not Jewish. But the neoconservative posture was particularly important inside the Republican Party for a period of time. The third group are homegrown, long-standing Republicans who've been around, and mostly we identify in the Midwest and in the South, and they have a deep-rooted history of republicanism. And they're an interesting cohort because they reflect their neighbors, they reflect the sort of social circuits that they work and live in, and they have been part of that Republican bent for a long period of time. The fastest growing part are religious value conservatives, that's your Orthodox community, who align with evangelicals on a number of issues and who see a shared sort of identity with regard to the role and place of religion as a kind of public expression and no longer simply privatized or separate from the state, but should be seen as part of the public square. And then, of course, we know that there are a whole cadre of Republicans who do not identify with Donald Trump and therefore have sort of removed themselves, at the moment at least, from the Republican mainstream. We have social justice Democrats, and they are a long and historic piece to the Democratic story. They align with the linkages between their Tikkun Olam Jewish values and the sort of social justice postures that various civic groups and organizations reinforce for them. So their liberalism and their social justice piece are the combinations of both what they see as comfortable for them both Jewishly and politically. And this is the single largest sort of cohort piece within the Democratic Jewish constituency. But there are other phenomenon pieces as well that we want to identify. There are some Jewish Democrats who have come to the Democratic Party around very specific issues, whether it's abortion or whether it's a ton of other questions that really drive their passion. And that list includes gun safety. It may include any number of other domestic or even foreign policy considerations. But those voters have come to their position as having found a place within the Democratic ranks that aligns with their own political priorities. And then there are the red diaper babies. Who are those folks? They're fascinating. They are the great-grandchildren, in some cases the grandchildren, of the old socialists. And they saw their parents and grandparents opposing Vietnam. They have become part of that world. We estimate that to be about 8% of the Democratic Party's Jewish constituency. They're students on campuses or young adults or even older folks who are critical at this point of Israel, critical of U.S. support at this point of Israel, concerned that the human rights issues of the Middle East are not being adequately addressed or managed. So they're on the fringe of the Democratic Party because we don't have alternative parties to sort of go to. So for them, they become part of that wing of the Democratic Party that's sort of rejectionist, a Bernie Sanders extension. I mean, I think this election is about a series of ideological principles that sit behind these candidates, even if they don't articulate them with all that great clarity. National conservatism is very different from traditional Reagan conservatism. This is what we're seeing in Hungary, in Poland, in France. We are seeing it expressed in the rise of authoritarianism and the political right in various parts of the world. And it has a place even in the United States at this point in the political discourse. The second piece to this is populism. And Donald Trump has become a populist candidate. He follows in a tradition of Huey Long and of Theodore Roosevelt and of Andrew Jackson, all of whom saw this same ideological and philosophical point that you want to identify with the passions, the fears, the anger, and the frustrations of your constituencies. And so Trump has effectively embraced that posture. A third piece that we see inside of the Republican ranks today is Christian nationalism. This is an extension of the evangelical movement to suggest that America is a Christian nation. And if you look at Christian nationalist ideology, or the construct of it, it's deeply embedded in the notion that the country is God's gift to the world, that this is a very special society, and that as a result, the politics of this society ought to be reflected in the religious values and practices and outcomes. So for these three ideological principles, we see a whole construct of what the Republican Party has sought to become, which is to create a kind of series of policy positions that reflect the views and the instincts of these particular ideas. On the Democratic side, we are seeing the continued extension of democratic liberalism, but it's being challenged on the far left, as we know, by what I guess we would call postmodernism. And postmodernism are all of the ideas associated with intersectionality, critical race theory, woke culture. It is a critique on whiteness and on American society and on culture. And it is a challenge to the status quo. And it can take and does take various forms, both inside the political world, but also we're seeing on our university campuses and elsewhere. It is particularly significant that these ideas also are competing both for and against the Jewish voter. Because it's the first time, in a sense, we're being postulated with the question, are Jews white people? Now, this is less to do with our Sephardic, Mizrahi, or Ashkenazi origins. It has far more to do with how we are perceived politically. The far right charges that Jews are seeking to replace us, and that was the language used in Charlottesville in 2017. The far left is using on the college campuses and elsewhere the principle that Jews are no longer a minority. They are white. They are powerful. They have achieved credibility and are in a position today of influence. So they have lost their minority status and they've taken on their whiteness. So this has become a really interesting but challenging place of where the Jewish community finds itself today, and where the politics, in a sense, are about the question of Jewish whiteness. Associated with that question is the sense of trust. Trust is the single major factor in a political system's success or failure. If people believe the system works, believe its candidates are legitimate, worthy of support, and the institutions around politics are credible, the courts, the Congress, the presidency, that's all essential for democracy to work. Well, from 1970 to 2024, we've seen a consistent decline in the loss of trust, which is precisely why we are seeing the kind of politics we see today, because people have, in a sense, felt the country has left them, or they feel left out by the country and its institutions. And that's the deep and agonizing issue of whether you can trust the election or trust the candidate. And that's really the most powerful theme we've seen in this particular election. We worry in this election about one other factor: apathy and fatigue. Many analysis suggests that in 2020, we turned out 67% of eligible voters. Now that sounds low, but that was the highest percentage of voters we've seen turning out for an American election since 1900. Since 1900. Only in the Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy campaign in 1960 did we come even close to any of these numbers. So the question will be whether we will be falling back to something like 60% voters in 2 weeks from now, or whether or not folks will turn out in the significant numbers that both political parties are hoping for, at least in terms of getting their voters to the polls. I know you can't read this, but that's okay. This is not a test for your eyes, but this is simply for me to tell you what it does represent. These then are the number of Jews per state, both in actual numbers and percentages, just to sort of remind us that we're spread out, but yet, as we know, the top 8 states, the ones we've talked about earlier, are really the keys to where Jews live. And you can't read this one either, but these are the 20 key congressional districts. We live as a community, for most of us, in one of these key congressional districts. New York's 17th, Florida's 24th are the two that we watch the most. Why? Because they're the largest numbers. And this district right here in the San Fernando Valley is also very significant, as is the one where Ted Lieu is the congressperson. This is Brad Sherman's, in case you forgot your congressperson. And these are the two districts where, again, we have significant numbers of Jews, the West Side and here in the San Fernando Valley. But those districts are much larger, and they are much more gerrymandered. Do you know what the term gerrymandered means? Than you would think. So that Brad Sherman has a district that is really kind of crazy, but so is Ted Lieu's. For that matter, all of the 50-odd congressional seats in the state are so configured. But the importance of this is that we can sort of get a trend line from these districts about specific Jewish voting patterns. This may be the most interesting chart we have. This is produced last spring of June. It's produced by the Jewish Electoral Institute, which is a nonpartisan group which produces polls. And I haven't shown you their polls because they haven't produced a poll since the Biden-Trump campaign was in play, and I don't think that would be fair to suggest that that still has an impact. But what this is suggesting to us is that for the first time in our history, the top issue for American Jews is the future of democracy. We've never seen that before. What we haven't normally seen is, because we are an older voting constituency, healthcare issues is a much more priority-based concern. It's very low here. And look where Israel is. Israel is 4th. And Israel was never ranking 4th for the last 20 years because there was not a crisis that forced us or Israel to sort of be seen with such a priority and consideration as the past year. But look also where abortion is. Likewise, Jews are the largest per capita supporters of this issue, in other words, the right of a woman for choice, than any other group in the United States. And now, of course, you could say that, well, Catholics would be opposed to abortion, yes, but they don't rally in the same way to the issue as we're seeing with Jewish voters and Jewish polls that show how significant abortion is for Jews. By the way, also on gun violence, Jews are profoundly interested in that issue, and while it ranks only here as sort of 8%, when compared with other religious communities, it's a very high percentage. Maybe because our tradition is tied to the notion of texts and study, but Jews rank the Supreme Court, even if we can't vote for the court and have no control over who's selected to serve on the courts. We view the Supreme Court and who makes those appointments as very critical to the Jewish community. So in a poll that was done this last week by the Manhattan Institute, it had an extraordinarily high number of Jews ranking the issue of how court the justices to the Supreme Court are chosen is profoundly important to Jewish audiences, far more so than for Protestants, Catholics, or any other community. Climate change is here as 14%, but if you asked younger American Jews their priorities on that issue, you would see it much higher, as just a case in point. So the issues in this campaign, at least from what we've been able to absorb, and the letters by each name or each of the terms, D and R is obviously Democrat or Republican, but just to point out that these are the issues that everyone is telling us, including Jewish audiences, are their concerns and their priorities. I mean, I think for our American Jewish community, these are important questions. The last two on here, the vote, whether the Jewish vote is changing. Well, we know it will ebb and flow, but what we also know is that Jewish voters are changing, meaning we have a 70% intermarriage rate between 2010 and 2020 of young Jews marrying other folks. And that 70% intermarriage rate will have ultimately an impact on Jewish political behavior. Fewer numbers of Jews will identify Jewishly. Jews by choice will also impact how and what the Jewish electorate will look like. And the other factor is that as our numbers shift and as we grow older, there are new constituencies emerging that will replace us. Muslim Americans will replace Jewish Americans as the third largest religious cohort, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, in the year 2040. So we are seeing significant shifts in the Jewish community in terms of the changing dimensions of who we are, and other groups emerging in terms of their presence in this society. The phrase Jewish homelessness up there is only introduced because a number of Jews are saying they're less comfortable today with their choices and their concerns, whether it's the far right or the far left, whether it has to do with how the United States is addressing a host of issues, including its relationship with Israel, and the concerns over anti-Semitism. So this is changing the sort of layers of how Jews see themselves in the context of the political spectrum. So just a reminder, these are the core dates. But the question, the biggest question, at least in my mind, is what happens on November 6th, the day after, or the weeks after, because we probably will not know the outcome of this election. Most folks are telling us that it will take about 5 days before we'll have a full accounting, especially if it is as close as we are projecting. And it's also about who will vote, as we've suggested earlier, and who will not. And it is the question as well about the integrity of the vote in terms of whether there will be court cases or other charges about this campaign and its integrity. And as we would conclude, in so many different ways, American democracy is on this ballot. Thank you for your attention. So I think we'll take questions.
Questions? Really? No questions?
This was just, for me, wonderful. I thought it was so informative and so intelligent, and I so appreciate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact that the current war, Israel war, has on the Jewish vote.
The impact of this war on the Jewish vote. It has certainly heightened the issue of Israel as a ballot concern, meaning more Jews are looking at which candidate or which party will deliver support or continue to grow that support for Israel. That's issue one. As I suggested, there's a portion of the Jewish community, and I estimate it to be about 8%, and that's mostly younger Jewish voters, who may probably not see this as their highest priority, but will definitely see it as one where they differ from their parents or their parents' generation in terms of their feeling that there needs to be, quote, a more balanced perspective about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So in that context, it has an impact for certainly many families where the difficulty of having conversations with one's kids over Israel has been a very divisive and difficult scenario. The effect of this war, however, on other voters also needs to be understood. On Arab American voters, we note a lot of shifts from historically being Democratic to either non-voting or supporting Donald Trump. And of course in Michigan, with its more significant population of Arab Americans, we're looking at a lot of that data to see what the effect will be on the outcome in Michigan. So it has implications beyond the Jewish community, but certainly for the Jewish community, it sort of is reflecting some of the shifts or the divisions we see inside our community.
I have just about had enough of folks standing in front of computer screens in the morning, pointing at colored maps and telling me everything's within 0.2% at this point. Do you have any polling that you actually have found over the years to be more or less, sort of, kind of reliable? Just curious.
Well, what we learned from the 2016 campaign, as you know, is that polling was highly problematic in terms of really reaching the mindset of many Americans. And the question is whether the pollsters have been able to do a better job in 2024 to sort of get the full intensity and reality of where voters are. And some of us are of the mind that maybe we don't yet have that mastered, and that what we're likely to see is that 3 to 5% of voters may not have told the pollsters, their actual sort of beliefs or behaviors, or they have been silent voters, meaning they've not articulated to their friends, to their families, or in any other setting what they're actually going to do. And as last-minute choices could really swing or move this election in ways that maybe the polls don't reflect at the moment. So I don't know that I can give you good comfort. I think we're all living on the edge. And that's one of the behaviors or outcomes of this election, is that we know nothing more than we knew really weeks ago. I mean, this election did change on July 21st. There was no question. And that was the date that Joe Biden withdrew. And within that 24-hour period, as you know, the vice president emerges as the Democratic nominee. And by the way, that 24 hours will become a very interesting case study of how the Democratic Party managed that without a contest, without a sort of a battleground of other contestants. And I think that will be really fascinating to look at those 24 hours. The other interesting phenomenon here is that we are seeing some changes in the behavior of Donald Trump. We don't know what all of that means. But clearly, the last several weeks have shown some shifts, and we don't quite know what that may reflect in terms of his health or well-being.
I was a little surprised about the categories which you had in the June survey in terms of what people are interested. And I would, the thing what I've been missing, and maybe the reason I'm missing it is because this developed later. So, I don't know what the current survey might look like. But my issue is, how come that we Jews, one of the most important topic is anti-Semitism. And particularly, obviously, in the United States, this topic, this really didn't much exist until the last year, per se. It doesn't show up as a major criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is that these polls don't reflect that. But if we took a look at the American Jewish Committee studies of American Jewish concerns or issues, it is there. But that's an internal sort of communal assessment as against a political assessment. The one correction to your comment, I agreed, the amount or levels of anti-Semitism this past year have skyrocketed, and the ADL confirms that by showing the data from each of the last number of years. But what is interesting is that we began to already see some of these trends in 2012, even before Donald Trump's presence in 2015 when he becomes an active candidate. Part of this is an outgrowth of Barack Obama's election, the rise of some hate groups and militias on the far right. And at the same time, the beginnings of the development of the far left and the progressives, which come later, but are counterpoint to what we see on the right. And so today, 24% of Americans are classified as being anti-Semitic. Now that's very high. In 2012, those numbers, the ADL reported 12% of Americans held, on the basis of the ADL's formula, there are 11 principles. Jews have too much power. Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. Jews only appoint their friends in their businesses. Jews have too much influence in the United States, etc. These 11. If you score 6 or more, according to the ADL, you are identified as either an anti-Semite or potentially to be one. And those numbers have radically shifted. And the shift is not coming from our generation. And it's not coming from our 35 to 50 or 60-year-olds. It's coming from our 18 to 35-year-olds who are far more likely to hold views negative about Jews and other groups, by the way, than we've seen from any other generation. And that's the real challenge on anti-Semitism. And correct, you're correct that it doesn't show up here, but it is very clearly an issue that the Jewish community obviously is. The questioner was asking how much influence, in my mind, the university students and university voters have in this election. Frankly, we know that young people vote in far less significant numbers than older voters. I mean, we've got tons of data on that. So already we know that that's one factor where their influence or capacity to influence is not likely to be particularly significant. But we do know that if voters turn out, they usually are turning out in that younger cohort around issues that have particular relevance to them. And climate change, far more so than hating Jews or whatever other policy, whether it's Israel or any other, is far more of a priority because they see that as existential to their existence. They see the Israel conflict as problematic, but they don't view it with the same degree. We have some more questions. Yes?
Yeah, hi. First of all, thanks for a great presentation. It was really informative. Donald Trump is on record stating that if he doesn't win, it'll be the Jews' fault. Okay? And my question is, what kind of impact does that sentiment have on the Jewish vote?
Good question. I don't know that we know that the answer to that in any statistical way, because we have so few polls, and as far as I know, none of the pollsters have asked, what does that statement mean to you, or how does it affect your vote, or whatever. So I haven't seen anything to that effect. I was interviewed by a Washington Post reporter, but his interest was on Maryland, and because he's obviously covering the senatorial race in Maryland, he's covering the Trump-Harris impact in Maryland. And he was asking that question in the context of Maryland. And from his assessment, as he goes to audiences in the Jewish community and asking them such a question as you just did, he's sensing that that's just one more of many reasons why either Jews love or oppose Donald Trump. The sense that they think that Trump is actually right, that Jews are making a serious mistake if they support the other side. So it depends on where you are on this political spectrum and how you see it. So it's in some cases it's an energizer. In other cases it's an alarmist perspective. So I would just leave it at that in the point that we clearly don't know a lot about its fullest or complete implications for us. I think this may be the last question. Yes, okay.
Do you have a sense of which of the presidential candidates that the entire Jewish bloc is leaning toward?
Well, I think I showed you the polling data that clearly the vice president has about, as the Pew study suggests, 65% of the Jewish vote.
65% for Kamala. Thank you.
And and that's the low end of that number, yeah. Well, thank you very much, and
Thank you, Steve.